6 years old now, part of which is obvious because it's our 6th annual conference. We do try to put on one a year, and this one we had to throw together because of the pending implementation of the bail reform legislation. And so we are grateful to all the panelists who responded so quickly to our request to come and join and have this conversation, and happy to have you all here with us today. So on behalf of President Mason and our Director of the Office of Academic Research, we will get going here. Special thanks to the Legal Action Center, who partners with us on the New York City Health and Justice Working Group. So I see a lot of familiar faces around the room from that group. There's a little more detail on the back page there about some of the policy and implementation efforts that we try to focus on through that group. We have about, I would say, somewhere between 60 and 70 active members in that group. Usually we meet 4 or 5 times a year, draw a crowd of 30 to 40. And in the early years, we really tried to identify some of the challenges of serving folks who are either on community supervision or in the jails or transitioning back from jails and prisons to the community. And we've been lucky enough to have a number of great government partners come in and present some of the new programs that they're looking to implement, some of the contracts that they'll be rolling out, and even just last week, last month, we had a great presentation on some additional housing resources that will be coming, because we know that is always one of the biggest challenges in serving our clients. And so Legal Action Center, Sebastian Solomon, before he went up to work in the state legislature, and Tracy Gardner have co-chaired that with me. And we are very hopeful that the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services will respond positively to the state's request for 30 days of in-reach Medicaid billable services, which would be a first in the country if they do allow that. And so that application is pending, something to keep your eye on. And that effort, in particular, the state Medicaid waiver, is something that both the Langeloth Foundation and the Vanna Meringen Foundation have supported us and Legal Action Center to do. So we are grateful for their support and for the efforts of the various members of our group to drive those policy changes that we want to see and that we know will have a significant impact on care continuity, which is certainly something that we're going to focus on here today. And so in putting together these events, I always come to you to give an opening and say, I really feel lucky to be doing the job that I do, because I meet so many interesting people in trying to coordinate these things, and a handful of them actually agree to come talk to you, so you get to meet some of those folks as well. And I learned so much in putting these things together, and it really drives some of the work that we are able to do through P2PH. I would not be out here without Yerlene Rodriguez, our research coordinator. There is a flyer floating around, or a research brief floating around. There's a bunch of copies up here in the resource table if you have a chance in one of the breaks. She wrote a great piece on how we can address the opioid overdose crisis, focusing on overdose fatalities and really the range of harm reduction services that we have available to us. And hopefully now that Philadelphia has won their lawsuit, we'll see some renewed energy in New York City to be opening safe consumption sites or safe injection facilities, which we know is one of the best strategies we have to reduce fatalities from overdose. And I would say in the current political climate is not in favor, but let us remember that needle exchange programs were not in favor when they were first introduced either. And so there's a range of opportunities for us to focus on and focus on implementing and get behind our elected leaders who are behind those efforts, and we have to help them drive those pieces. So the morning session today is going to be a primer on what is bail reform, how is it going to impact the operations of the courts, how is it going to impact, in a very immediate sense, the impact of the discharge planning efforts that are going to be happening in the jail, and what we can expect next year. For those of us who are on the weeds on this, we know there's a bail list of about 800 people that have been identified that, as of January 1, cannot be held by the city anymore because they would not be eligible under the new legislation. And so when they come to their court date in December, the judge is either going to discharge them from the court, or they're going to set a date and say, you've got to let this person out by then. And so I know a lot of the people implementing this, and I was joking earlier, I just get to talk about the policy implications of it. I'm not actually responsible for all the logistics of it, but those challenges are real. And I know there's a lot of anxiety about making sure that we get that right and that we don't have some big mistakes that hit the hit the news more often than the successes. And so there's a lot of focus on how we provide appropriate supports to those folks. And so we'll hear first from one of our fellow research centers here from the Data Collaborative for Justice, from Olive Liu, who gave a great presentation up in Albany, and I said, I want you to give that one down to some of my partners here in the city about what bail reform is going to look like. And then we have 4 of our good friends from Correctional Health Services who are going to deliver a presentation on who's in jail now, what are their health needs, and how are we working to meet those needs both when they're in the jail and how do we partner with folks in the community. And then the second morning panel focuses on what are our current efforts to ensure care continuity and provide services to those who are on ATI and care continuity. So the morning session is more focused on bail reform and those impacts. The afternoon session, which we certainly hope you'll stick around for, we've got a great lunch service that'll be provided by MBJ Food Services. They've always done well with us in the past, and so we're thrilled to have them back again. Grab another scone if you have a chance. And so the afternoon session will say, okay, based on the needs that we identified in the morning among this population, what are we doing to meet those needs generally in the community? How do we not stigmatize or avoid stigmatizing people by creating specific access points or types of services that we have for those broad range of folks? What are we doing to meet those public health needs more broadly in the community? And then the later afternoon session is going to focus on those non-clinical needs that we know clients have. So access to education, employment, housing, social and emotional wellness that we know is so important to our day and to our ability to engage and attend in our many tasks. And so that's something we know is a challenge for folks. So join me in welcoming our friend Olive Liu from the Data Collaborative for Justice, and she'll kick off our first presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to Jeff for inviting me to present to you today on some analyses that the Data Collaborative for Justice actually publicly released a couple of months ago. So this is a bail brief. It's an analysis of kind of the potential impacts of the bail reforms moving forward. And we actually have some copies of the bail brief on that table there. You're welcome to take a copy. There are more details in there than what I'm presenting today. So I just want to quickly thank our data partner, the New York State Office of Court Administration. They provided us all the data that we use for these analyses, and then also to Arnold Ventures, who funded this work. And I just want to give a brief introduction to the Data Collaborative for Justice for those of you who are not familiar. So we are a research center here at John Jay. We started in about 2013 as the Misdemeanor Justice Project. We've since rebranded. So we work closely with state and local agencies. They provide us data, and we analyze that data. And we maintain kind of a neutral stance when we do these analyses. We basically, look at the data and publish trends on what is happening in terms of enforcement, court processing cases, caseloads, confinement in jails and prisons. And so far we've published 13 reports and briefs, with more in the works, on New York City and New York State criminal justice system. So the analyses that I'm presenting today, they're the first in a series that we are doing on the 2020 reforms. So keep an eye on our work coming up. Okay, so I'm going to give kind of a quick and dirty overview of the bail reforms. I'm sure most of you in this room know to some degree what these reforms are. So first and foremost, the kind of big difference of the New York State bail reforms from other reforms that have been implemented in other states like New Jersey is that this is a charge-based change in conditions for bail. So The reforms eliminate money bail for most misdemeanors, except for sex offenses, criminal contempt, and violating orders of protection. Most nonviolent felonies, except for witness intimidation, just highlighting they're operating as a major trafficker, and a few others. And then 2 offenses that are considered to be violent felonies, so second-degree robbery and felony burglary. So even though these types of offenses will no longer be eligible for money bail, if there are concerns regarding flight risk, a judge can impose the least restrictive non-monetary conditions. So there's still some degree of discretion here. And then for cases that are still eligible for money bail, so those that are not on this, well, the exceptions and then other things that are not on this list, the courts must consider an individual's financial circumstances, so ability to pay. So when the reforms came out in April, our organization, we hadn't, planned to do these analyses until the reforms were signed into law. So we took that as a really great opportunity to kind of look at where we've been in terms of the use of bail in New York, and then kind of thinking about where we could go after January 1st. And hopefully all of you know that January 1st is when the laws will actually come into effect. So beyond that, we also wanted to kind of give shape and make concrete something that seems to be really uncertain. And at least I know, speaking to a lot of people in a lot of different forums, that these impending reforms are leading to a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. So we kind of wanted to put some shape around that, quantify it a little bit, just to give folks a sense of what could happen. So we have 3 main research questions. First, how would the number of cases requiring money bail in 2018 be impacted if the 2020 reforms had already been in place? So if we apply the conditions that will come into effect on 2018 data, what would the universe have looked like? 2, how would these trends vary by borough? Because we know there are a lot of important borough-level differences. And then 3, what would these trends have looked like over time? So like I said, our data come from the Office of Court Administration for New York State, but for these analyses, we only focus on New York City criminal court arraignments. We weren't able to get the data for statewide, but we thought the New York City criminal court arraignments at least provides a good sense of what's happening. So we have data from 2005 to 2018, and we exclude any cases that were arraigned in Supreme Court. So these are just criminal court arraignments. So we first looked at kind of the overall picture of cases that were arraigned in New York City in 2018. So these are the actual numbers. So this pie is showing first that 32% of about 200,000 arraigned cases in 2018 were disposed at arraignment. So kind of moving forward with these analyses, we assume that rate is going to stay the same, just because we, can't really make very accurate assumptions otherwise. So we assume that rate is the same, and we kind of put that aside because these cases are disposed already. And then we have about 52% of these cases that were released without bail. So this is an important chunk of the pie that we are interested in. And here we have, like 15.5% of cases that had bail set, either posted or not posted, which is actually the larger chunk of that. And then less than 1% of cases were remanded. Now, if we take out the disposed at arraignment cases and just look at the cases that were continued past arraignment, obviously the proportions change a little bit. So 76% of these were released without bail, and a combined 26% 3% had bail set and were either posted or not posted. So posted, not posted just means if the person actually paid or I was going to say posted again, but yeah, paid bail. And then 1.2% of cases were remanded. So I think it's safe to assume that the kind of, apart from the remanded proportion, which we are also going to assume is staying the same, the hypothesis is that the reforms are going to impact these kind of three, the blue chunk and the yellow and orange segments of the pie. So this is those three segments combined together. So the lighter blue bar is, if you remember, the segment of the pie that were cases released without bail in 2018. So that's about 105,000 cases. Now, if we apply the 2020 reforms, so those conditions, the misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies, to that, we find the darker blue bar, which shows us that if the 2020 reforms had been in place in 2018, there would have been about over 20,000 more cases released without bail. So 90% of continued cases would have been released without bail. And then just to kind of give it a little more, make it a little bit more dramatic, those 20,000 additional cases equates to about $200 million in bail that would not have been set. And this is citywide. So then we thought that it was really important to look at this by borough because, as you all know, we have 5 DAs with varying caseloads, with varying types of cases that they prosecute, with varying degrees of enforcing bail reforms, perhaps. So we wanted to look at the different impact of the reforms on each borough. So again, we did the same kind of method. We first took the actual number and proportion of cases released without bail in 2018, which are the lighter blue bars. So in the Bronx, all the way to the right, we have just under 80% of cases in the Bronx were released without bail. And then if we apply the 2020 reforms to that, we see an additional 3,000 cases released without bail. Brooklyn had the largest volume of non-monetary releases in 2018, would continue to have so, with an additional 4,000 cases. Manhattan, 72% were released without bail in 2018, and our estimate is that Manhattan would actually have the largest increase in cases released without bail. Queens, similar numbers, and then Staten Island has the lowest volume, but similar proportions, and the smallest increase, so just over 1,000 additional cases. And then if we kind of think about this in terms of cost and dollar amounts, we have a range of $10 to $86 million in bail that would not have been set for each borough. And so finally, we wanted to look at this kind of longitudinally, to look at historically what has happened with bail, the use of bail in New York City, applying the conditions, estimating what would have happened if the 2020 reforms had been in place in these years, from 2005 to 2018, just to see kind of if our estimates are reliable and that 2018 isn't some sort of anomaly. So the blue line shows the actual proportion of cases released without bail for each year. So from about 60% of cases in 2005 to 76% in 2018, as you've already seen. So this is a pretty consistent increase over the 13 years. And then the orange line is our estimate if we apply the reforms to each year. And it's consistently at 90%. So this kind of gives us encouragement that our estimates are reliable. And of course, we're not saying that we're assuming this is going to happen for the next 13 years, but at least there's some consistency. And also, we wanted to apply the reforms to a period of time when there was high enforcement, especially of misdemeanors, which is, I think, around 2011. So you still see that consistency despite the dramatic changes in enforcement, which is not on this graph, but believe me when I say that. And then just to kind of give you a really big number to think about, over the 13 years, this would have been a cumulative 555,000 more cases released without bail. So potentially 555,000 people released without bail, had the reforms already been in place over these years. So to summarize, we find that if we apply the reforms in 2018, over 20,000 cases, over 20,000 additional cases would have been released without bail. That's a cumulative, maybe not reduction, but $200 million in bail that wasn't set, that would not have been set. And we find variation across borough, which we expected, I think. And then over time, so longitudinally, there are 555,000 additional cases released without bail. So I just want to circle this back to kind of how this relates to you folks here who have the easy task of figuring out how to deal with all of this after January 1st. So in terms of, the additional cases released without bail, the hypothesis is that this is going to dramatically reduce detention rates. Of course, we don't actually know what that will look like in actuality, but this is, I think, a pretty solid assumption that other folks have made. For example, the Center on Court Innovation. And so what that means for you all is perhaps thinking about, who, what, where in terms of supervised release, who are the people who will be needing these services. So one of the drawbacks with using administrative data, which is what we use for these analyses, is that we don't have individual level information. So we don't actually know the composition of that 20,000 additional cases. So we don't know who actually will be impacted, which is, an area for future research. But at least if you have kind of an estimate of what that, how large that group will be, you can start to think operationally maybe about where to, I'm like going out of order here, but where to delegate your resources, whether to increase manpower, that kind of thing. Another thing that I thought of would be important in relation to this is access to care. So if we had information on where individuals would be released to, so their communities, then you would have a better sense of how to reach out to them, how to locate the people who are most in need. So these are some questions that you could think about. So if we had more data on this, I would be able to provide some more concrete answers on these things, but unfortunately we don't have that capacity right now. So areas for future research. So if you remember from that first pie chart, there were 32% of cases were disposed at arraignment. So we had assumed that that rate would stay the same just because we couldn't accurately do so otherwise. But in reality, we think that the reforms will also impact this group. So one question that we have is whether this proportion will change as a result of the reforms, and whether that will then add to that, 20,000 additional cases. And then if you also remember from the outset, I mentioned that part of the reforms is that judges have to determine financial circumstances, ability to pay in cases where bail is still eligible. So a question that comes from that is, how will courts actually meaningfully determine this? What are the kind of measures and standards that will be in place to make sure that this is done in a systematic way? Will appearance rates and dispositions change as a result of the bail reforms? And then, of course, the community and individual level impact of these reforms, especially on those who will be released without bail. And with that, I thank you all for listening, and I welcome questions about any of the information that I just presented. Thank you. Questions? I think we have time. I'm not sure what time it is. Yes?
Who has the data at the individual level?
Who has the data at the individual level? I think, so individual level data, the agencies do have that. They just won't, for privacy issues, they don't give that to researchers. But I think one of the issues with agency data is that they're very siloed. So to get the most comprehensive individual level data, you would have to kind of go to all the different agencies that work together in this whole system and to get all of those together. And what we have found is that the data don't always speak to each other, and it's most of the time it's the same data, but people code it in different ways, different variables. It's just very difficult to link them up and to actually use them in a meaningful way. So for us, administrative data has been easier to work with. But the caveat to a lot of our work is that we unfortunately don't have individual level data just because government agencies are so siloed in their work. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, in the same way that you did this with the bail reform, would you be able to also do the same thing with the discovery reform that was placed? Could you determine how much people had they received their discovery, maybe they wouldn't be convicted of a crime?
Yeah.
Be able to do that?
So we have hopes of doing some analyses on how the reforms would impact case processing, and I think discovery goes into that. But I think one of the issues with analyzing discovery is that the data is so this data that we use is pretty clear cut. It's just like numbers. Discovery data, you would have to go to prosecutors and defense lawyers, and it's just very hard to kind of wade through all of that. And I know saying that data is difficult to work with is such a, it's not a good excuse. But there are so many, I think aside from that, there are so many factors that are just unseen factors with discovery and courtroom practices that is just really difficult for researchers to kind of get a hold of. Yeah. So I'm sorry. Yes.
I'm sort of following up on that. Is there any effort to create an interagency group that is combing the data? Because the opposition is going to use horror stories to make the whole bill look terrible.
Right.
So having information quickly available and counter stories is pretty essential.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the interagency collaboration, but at least I know that, with the with January 1st coming up in like 3 weeks, agencies in the state and, local agencies are kind of scrambling to have better data systems put in place, because practitioners and people who are service providers, people who work with the individuals that are actually impacted by all of these reforms, they need better support in terms of data, and kind of as a result of the reforms being rolled out in such a, quick manner. So I know that there are efforts to provide more of a data infrastructure, but I can't really speak to the interagency, issue. Yes, hi.
Hi, and thanks for sharing. In your work, did you look at what charges were left over, like the folks who are going to remain incarcerated? Is there an idea of what the top charges were retroactively and what that looked like moving forward?
I did do this as a kind of later, there was a request for that analysis. If we connect after this, I could give you my information and we could connect offline, but I don't have it off the top of my head, but we did look at charges because people are concerned about the charge level differences in this. Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Right. Oh, yes.
Just for a comment, I want to thank you for pointing out the dollar amount and the impact of that, because I think we're thinking more of individuals, but seeing the amount that is being spent on individuals that should not have to pay that amount to the city.
Right.
And what the city is doing with that.
Right.
And they're thinking, and it has so many other, so much more of an impact, thinking of why they will incarcerate people, why they will have people post bail,
Right.
because it's money going into the city.
Right.
So
Yeah.
thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually kind of a later part of this analysis that came up from one of our stakeholders, I guess, who brought this issue up about the dollar amount. And I just want to kind of reiterate, that was the dollar amount that was set. So, we know that people can't pay what they're set. And so seeing that ceiling of $200 million is just kind of wild. Okay, I think my time is up, but thank you all for your questions. And I'll be here, so thank you.